Hello and welcome to this Debating Europe panel, where our experts respond to your questions and comments on Europe in this, the last in a series of debates on the future of healthcare, run in partnership with MSD, called Healthcare Next, a citizen-centric approach. Today we're asking, how can the EU best support health research and innovation? My name is Jackie Davis, and I will be leading this discussion with Virginia Acha, Global Lead Global Regulatory Policy at MSD, and Biotechnology and Research and Innovation Consultant Pierre Moyet. So a very warm welcome to both of you. And today I'm going to be putting some of the questions that you, Debating Europe readers and viewers, have been submitting during the course of this series. So those of you who've been following us all the way through, some of you sent in some supplemental questions, and we're going to try and cram as many of those into the next 30 minutes as we possibly can. So let's crack on and see how we get on. So Ginny, perhaps I could turn to you first on our first question, which comes from Olivier, who points out that health is not an EU competency, and asked, should the EU even be involved in supporting health research and innovation? When I look at this question, Ginny, I hear really, this is the central question. How do you see the EU's role, given that almost all the responsibility for health policy currently lies with the member states?
So thanks so much, Jackie, and really glad to be on the panel today with Pierre, addressing what I think is probably the most exciting of all the topics we've been addressing in this series, because it's really about what's going to lead to the future for improvements in healthcare. And to respond to the question that Olivier posed, I really want to bring us back to the key points around what we're discussing. So we are talking about health research and innovation. So what do we mean by those? First of all, health research is research undertaken to better understand, first of all, health and healthcare delivery, but it also can be about how do we intend to both treat and prevent disease. And I think innovation maybe is a more familiar topic for our listeners, but let's just be clear. Let's go to the traditional Oslo manual definition about the implementation of a new or significantly improved product, good, service, process that is then, or marketing method that then is used. And I think the underscore there is implementation. So how are we using it? And in both of those settings, I would argue that the EU has a really critical role to play. Number one, as an important funder and coordinator of health research, which, let's be honest, doesn't even just benefit Europe. It has a value beyond our borders and contributes to global science. And then in the innovation space, to set that process for implementation. And I will say funding and indeed purchasing or pricing, all of those are important signals. They're signals to researchers that this is an area of work that that society finds important. And so it's important for Europe to use its voice to signal where its interests lie. So I know there's a lot of expectations on the member states to manage their own healthcare systems, but Europe has such a critical role to play in creating that broader conversation and signaling to do the right research at the right time.
Thank you. And Pierre, of course, we have seen growing calls for the EU to play a greater role in health policy after the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw the EU coming together on that crucial issue of vaccines, but also on therapeutics. Do you agree that this is a moment of opportunity for the EU to play a greater role? And if so, what do we need to do broadly?
Well, absolutely, I do. And I think that the COVID experience has demonstrated, I think, the value of Europe-wide collaboration, especially as regards, for example, the way clinical trials were set up. And there was a lot of issues at the beginning of the COVID pandemic because indeed member states were doing their own thing, as it were. And it was obvious that they were not going to have the numbers that were going to be needed to do properly randomized studies, statistically significant studies. And so all of this, I think, just plays to the need for this collaborative approach and trans-Europe approach. And that relates to data flows. Now we know pandemic preparedness. meaningful clinical trials, and of course the scientific collaboration. And this will hopefully go towards accelerating uptake of new things, new innovations in different health systems. And I think there are reasonable arguments to say that we know why the competency remains within the member states, and there are some good reasons for that. But I think the research and innovation agenda can be much better when the collective play is there.
So, Ginny, there may be a bigger debate about the role of the EU in healthcare more generally, but you talked about using that voice that the EU have in this area. Do you think COVID-19 has strengthened the case for more European health research and innovation?
Oh, absolutely. I think Pierre mentioned a number of the points, but it's clear, we were much more impactful in the way we could coordinate our activities, share information. I mean, the one thing that we were most short of in the pandemic was information and time. So by being able to work together, we were able to leverage a lot more of what little resources were available to us about a very novel virus as quickly as we could. And I think those paths now established can be used for many other topics.
Thank you. Let's take another couple of questions from Debating Europe readers and viewers, and we'll take them together. The first comes from Caitlin, who argues that the best way for the EU to support health research and innovation is to deregulate and I'm quoting, cut the miles-long red tape for production and distribution in order to boost competitiveness. Bjorn thinks the main issue that's slowing down innovation is governments, and I'm quoting again, making it extremely expensive to bring new remedies to market. So are they right? What do you see as the key challenges that we need to address if we are to realize all this potential for pan-European health research and innovation and speed up this innovation process? Pierre first this time.
Well, I mean, obviously there's some necessary bureaucracy involved here, especially when we get to the regulatory pathways and so on and so forth. Once again, COVID, I think, demonstrated the abilities in pandemic situations that this can be dramatically accelerated. And I think that all of that knowledge and learning can flow back into normal product development pipelines. But basically, I think we need to have much more connections between the technology providers, regulators, and healthcare providers. And this is, I know that this is easy to say and not easy to do, but this needs to be that connectedness between the upstream and the downstream, including, of course, the patient voice and everything. This is the thing that is going to be key to accelerating the uptake of innovation. And then I know that pricing gets the economics of all this gets very complicated, but I think that's the key, that connectivity, and however we do that mechanistically, those connections need to be much more. They're not optimal today. They need to be optimized in a big way.
Perhaps we can come back on how you can do that a little bit later. But Ginny, in terms of the challenges, how do you see them?
Yeah, I'm going to carry on a bit of a theme from Pierre, and it won't surprise anyone. You announced my role is in global regulatory policy, so maybe you're asking, the one person in the room who really likes the regulation. But I will argue it this way, which is it's very difficult to innovate without effective regulation. And in fact, smart regulation shapes innovation very effectively for the future. So it's a two-way street. And you mentioned COVID-19 before. When we were dealing with COVID-19, it wasn't a case of saying, oh, well, cut all the paperwork, stop doing everything. It was quite the opposite. It was, let's try and coordinate, to use Pierre's word, let's collaborate, bring people together and identify what can we do in this much accelerated time frame, which is not going to cut down on the requirements or the security issues, but actually get us to the same point in a much more collapsed time frame. That's critical. And I think there's lessons from that, those flexibilities that we want to see persisting. And then, of course, in Europe, we have a really unique moment now with the review of the pharma legislation to really consider what is that, as FPIA calls, the regulatory road to innovation. How can we do this in a way that will create that smart regulation that shapes effective innovation that still meets the high risk, high reliability requirements we need for human healthcare interventions?
Ginny, do I take from your answer you don't think that currently the EU's framework is smart enough, that it is fit for purpose to meet these challenges, that you think some modernization is required?
Well, so that's always going to be true because we're looking at a moving target. Our tech regulation needs to move along with the path of technologies. And so it's the question of the work and the expanded information we have around biology, the human biology, disease biology, but it's also the new introductions of new technologies, which many of which have come through the IMI program that Pierre can talk more to, but that create opportunities to change and improve the services and the products and the interventions we offer. But take, for example, artificial intelligence. If you're going to introduce artificial intelligence into healthcare, you need regulation that can anticipate and correctly regulate it. So it's always a moving process, and it needs to be a regulatory framework that's able to move at that pace of science.
Pierre, for you, what is your assessment of the current framework? How smart is it? How fit for purpose is it? And if it isn't, as Ginny was saying, we have this unique moment, this review of the pharma regulations. What for you needs to change if it does need changing?
Well, everything, lots need to change. But I think, as Ginny said very correctly, this is a moving thing. So it's not saying, oh, the regulatory framework needs modernizing because it's a dinosaur. That's not the case. I think the regulatory, because of science and developments and so on, and as Ginny said, AI, they need to adapt. But it's not only the regulators that need to adapt, it's everyone needs to move here.
Right.
And this is the health technology assessors need to move. The way industry develops products needs to move. Everybody in the equation needs to move, sometimes outside their comfort zone, in order for us to optimize the situation. So it's not any particular piece in the cog. I think it's in the mechanism. I think it's everyone that all of the actors need to adapt.
And Pierre, going back to your point you made earlier about the connections, you said, between the technology providers, the regulators, the healthcare providers, how do we do that? Is it about more dialogue at earlier stages in research and innovation? What's the key, do you think, here? That's to Ginny's point about flexibility as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so that's certainly part of it. And a lot of the programs in the Innovative Medicines Initiative were focused on that, connections, and having people from the downstream functions in that everything you need to get innovation into use. Those people need to be brought in right from the beginning, and including the patient's voice here. And once again, that the wealth of that is, and the value of that is just magnified by the ability to do that pan-European, of course, because that brings lots of different perspectives. So I think that's the key, to build these collaborations at scale, at Europe level, and bringing in all of the actors that are needed to develop technology and provide the technology and pay for the technology.
And Ginny, you talked earlier about flexibility, and I'm also thinking here about the speed. Science moves faster and faster. The situation evolves. There is some criticism that Europe takes longer to approve new medicines than other parts of the world, than some of its competitors, that we saw during COVID. We saw the remarkable speed with which vaccines were developed and then approved. Again, lessons from that. How do we have a regime that is both agile and quick, and has that inbuilt flexibility, if you like, future-proofing our regulatory framework?
Yeah. I think that, Jackie, I think it's important for people to be aware that, it would be lovely to say we could have all those things all the time and at that speed, but it always involves a bit of a trade-off. And I think we're recognizing with regulators around the world that it's about understanding what can we improve in terms of our processes and our working arrangements, but it's also about understanding prioritization. And what will be prioritized, because I think one thing to say is the pace by which we all worked during the pandemic was like a sprint, and you can't keep sprinting forever. And in the same time, there were things that we were not taking on and advancing during the COVID period because all hands were on deck to deal with that. So if we want to come back to a situation where we're going to work on a number of different areas for health interventions, I'd like to see us take a very thoughtful approach from Europe that considers those trade-offs in a well-considered manner that reflects on not just immediate needs, but looks to the future and the opportunities that the broader stakeholder groups align. And then Europe needs to signal its interest in that space, including in regulatory, but also in basic research, in applied work, and so forth, and invest in it. Because I think, again, what we saw from the pandemic was that if there's no real interest in that space and we haven't prioritized it, as was the case for antivirals before we went into the pandemic, you're really struggling then to see, that pipeline of work to build on. We all had to reflect on what was really available to us in January 2020 when we were looking at what opportunities could we develop in that short time frame. So it really was a lesson to be prepared and be thoughtful in that preparation.
Yeah. Before we move on to some more questions from Debating Europe users, Pierre, to this question of future-proofing, what to you is the key to a regulatory framework for health, research and innovation, to getting new treatments, new medicines to market? What is the key to future-proofing it and making it adequately agile and flexible?
Well, I mean, a lot of the basic evidence is, of course, scientific evidence, and so we need to. I think Ginny already mentioned it. We need to make sure that there's balanced funding right across the spectrum, from fundamental research that's going to provide some of the evidence that the regulators are going to use to base their decisions on. And that balanced funding right across the spectrum, I think, is really, really crucial.
Thank you very much. Let us move to two questions about how we talk about this issue. Rudy argues we shouldn't approach health innovation as an economic problem. I'm quoting from Rudy now. When you are using terms like cost and investment, you are talking the language of business, says Rudy. This is corporate talk. Andrew believes that, and I'm quoting again, not investing in the health of all EU citizens is the actual expenditure. It's a cost by neglect. Might the social cost of not developing new healthcare innovations outweigh the R&D costs? So my question to you both, and perhaps start with you this time, Pierre, is do you agree with Rudy and Andrew about this framing of the discussion? And is it just about how we talk about the issue, or is it about viewing it in a very different way? I mean, more fundamental changes to the way we look at it?
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting question, I have to say. And I've struggled with this myself a little bit. I kind of come down on not agreeing with our friends because no matter how you're going to position healthcare, R&I, or whatever, we all know that governments are going to end up paying for this. And so it has to be budgeted in some way. And so there are always going to be budgetary constraints. And no matter how where you position it. And I think we need to look more at, okay, yes, we need to accelerate new innovations in healthcare and new treatments and so on and so forth. But in my view, we're not going to succeed in getting sustainable healthcare systems just looking at that. We have to go back and look at prevention. And if we don't look at prevention, we will never be able to afford high-end treatments for personalized medicine or whatever. So what we're not doing in Europe, or I would say in many other places, is investing massive amounts in prevention. Because those preventative strategies that are put in place, and I know politically they're not popular, it's very sensitive because these are long-term things that we need to do. But basically looking at the big healthcare drivers, right, like type 2 diabetes, just for one example, but many chronic diseases, we know that a lot of that is preventable, but there's not enough investment in that end. So that I understand the argument from our friends, but I don't think we can push that too far in terms of having a completely repositioned thing on healthcare. I think we need to go back and look at what the cost drivers are and see if we can put in some preventative strategies to avoid future healthcare costs. Otherwise, we're not going to have a sustainable system.
Thank you, Pierre. And Ginny, your reaction to Rudy and Andrew, but also to what Pierre was saying there, when we have the debate about where should public money, particularly, they were talking about the corporate side of investment as well, but where should public money be focused? Would you agree with Pierre? Prevention needs a lot more attention, often seen as less sexy and less urgent because not responding. But we are in an era of very serious pressures on government budgets, broadly on healthcare costs. But do we need to just reframe the debate, and where does the focus need to be?
So I think actually I wanted to go back to a point I made right up front, which is, an important way that we do both health research and health innovation is guided by signals. And it can be signals from governments when they set out what their research stall is going to be, or even governments and what they're willing to pay for healthcare work, including preventative interventions, and from the wider society where how people use their voice or their private insurance or their personal investments or whatever. And I think one important piece, and I can say this both from a commercial perspective, but also in my time when I was an academic, these sort of coordinating devices like the famous moon shots we have now, or Earth shot, or whatever shots we've got, those are big coordinating devices. Those used to be called the grand challenges, or they've come under various different names, but they're a way of trying to coordinate activity. And I think that's very positive, and certainly governments have sometimes had more or less success on them, but at least it's a very explicit and public signal that this is what we want to work on. And the same thing is true when you go into the shops, or when you're choosing to, any other innovation across society. You go to where you think you want to go, and that's the signaling that then innovators take, which is why we all have, your iPhone numbers keep going up, and I don't know how far they're going to keep going. But in healthcare, it's a little harder because that's not how we consume health innovation. It's a little different. So signaling is really important. It's not always clear, and it's not always aligned to everybody's perspectives, particularly since this varies around the world. But that's where an important debate like this one and the ones that are underway now under the pharmaceutical legislation are very important. And the pharma strategy, what does Europe want to prioritize? What do we value? Because besides, especially, taking Pierre's point a little bit further in prevention, what about the antimicrobial resistance issue that we've been talking about for decades? When are we finally going to see that? And some of that is signaling, some of that is not getting enough traction all the way throughout the system to really pull that innovation through. And finally, the biggest wild card in the pack is the science itself. Sometimes it's just we don't have a mature enough science base to really make the most of something. So, look at the Alzheimer investments we've had, again, over the past decade and a half, which hasn't gone very far. Now we have something now which may be disease modifying. We all hope this is a tipping point, but it really depends on the science. So signaling and investment can only go so far. That's a final point to just say, as much as I'd love to, just by switching the go button for investment doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get there in the end.
And then just to mention antimicrobial resistance, a topic we tackled in another discussion in this series. So do take a look if you have a moment. But one more question from a Debating Europe user, and then I have a final question to you both. JT asks, how can we support health research and innovation in a way that guarantees, quotes, equitable prices for the less affluent? So this raises a big concern. We talk a lot about unequal access to healthcare, to medicines, to treatments, and how to deal with it. So perhaps, Ginny, this is a question that's often asked of industry. So let me come to you first on this one. What do you say to JT? And I'm just thinking in this context, given aging populations, given those increases in healthcare costs that we were talking about, does funding some of this, the public money coming from the EU purse, so EU money that is spread across the member states, does this help to address the issue of unequal access at the very least, do you think? Is it part of the equation?
So to my mind, again, this is a question that's really about how you manage the diffusion of the innovation, the sort of the process by which you bring it into the healthcare system. And certainly there's a lot of creative ways to do that. It's very important to have a robust and thoughtful approach to that. And certainly under the COVID-19 setting, there's been a lot of creative work. I mean, I will throw out one example from my company and work around voluntary licensing arrangements. So there's ways to approach that. I don't, for my money though, that's not where the question should go from a research perspective. Research should be open to explore all angles wherever possible. And again, the most credible and supportive thing we can do with respect to health research is to encourage a number of researchers to take on, particularly signaling to them to address areas where it might be looking at a particular intervention that benefits a part of the world or a vulnerable group that's not been approached in the past. So it may be a better way of delivery, a better way to provide a vaccine that doesn't require cold chain, these sort of interventions that could be specifically supporting those vulnerable populations. And in innovation, it's about, bottom line, as I said earlier, find that innovation and that signaling that brings those products to those patients and operations. And certainly companies, if they feel like they are able and incentivized to approach that, they will. And I think we've seen already examples of that, many already with partnerships, and not just for my own company, but in several examples.
Thank you. And Pierre, how do you see this issue in that context? We're always talking about ways to enhance what one might call the 3 A's: access, availability, and affordability, and that link with the research, health and research and innovation agenda. How do you see it?
Yeah, so it's a really important thing. I think there are several pieces here. First is that I think already under Horizon Europe, there are sort of conditionalities of research funding where you, depending on what's being done at what stage of development and so on, there are rules around making sure that access and affordability is put into the equation. Some of that is quite difficult at sometimes, because there's not one magic formula to calculate how that should work. But at least in spirit, that's there. The other real issue is the lack of European Union funding that goes to so-called EU 13 countries, so those eastern countries in the European Union. And this is a big problem, because if more money could flow to those countries, I think the equitable access piece would be at least a more generally discussed pan-Europe. And I think this is an issue right across the board. I think there's a very small percentage of funding that goes to those countries. There are lots of reasons for that. But I've visited many of these countries, and there's no shortage of excellent science, excellent SMEs, excellent technologies, especially in the digital side with blockchain and AI and so on. So there's no real reason why those countries should not be more successful in attracting the funding than there is.
So but perhaps something we need to pay more attention to that balance in the future.
Balance, yes.
We are almost out of time, but I wanted to ask each of you, as you said at the beginning, Ginny, you said this was a unique opportunity, given the review, the current wide-ranging review of the EU's pharmaceutical policy framework. For each of you, of all the issues we've discussed in the last half an hour, if you had to identify a key next step, a key priority, if we are to ensure that the European Union provides the most effective support for that health and research and innovation and meets that competitiveness challenge, make sure that Europe remains a world leader in this area, what for you would it be? Does it relate to money? Does it relate to the regulatory framework? Does it relate to the innovation ecosystem? What for you is absolutely key?
So I can kick off, and I think I want to make this really an imperative for the European Union to consider in the world where we have so much so much innovation and health research ongoing anyway. So there's a heck of a lot that's going on in the US or in Asia Pacific. What is the unique role that Europe wants to play in this space, and how much does it want to play it? So what sort of an environment for health research and innovation is there? Is this something that as as a region, do we want to prioritize it? Is it very important, or are we happy to let others take a lead in some of these agendas globally and follow in suit? And I think that's a critical question from a strategic perspective, because so much falls from it in all the points you mentioned, Jackie. It will change the way Europe chooses to fund and retain and maintain funding for research in basic and applied areas. And as Pierre mentioned, where they place it in an equitable fashion across all of the European member states. It matters for the pharmaceutical legislation and the way we're going to harness that development and what we do with it. And critically, and usually left out of the equation, but to me, equally important, I could have the best researchers in the world, but if the environment doesn't really draw out, doesn't really have the signaling that says, yes, we prioritize and value innovation, it's probably not going to land here. So we really need to have that full start to finish approach if that's where Europe's mind is placed.
Thank you, Ginny. Pierre, you have the last word.
Thanks. Well, just on Ginny's point, I don't think Europe has a choice. I think Europe has to prioritize healthcare innovation because it has to be, that is part of the prioritization for the health of European citizens, and without that, the whole thing won't work. So I think that has to be a priority. I'm going to repeat two things that I've already said, I'm afraid, Jackie. One is, for me, that this connectiveness between those providing technologies and those who are using it or paying for it, I think that needs to be, so that there's a dialogue, there's an understanding. People still use different languages, whether you're on the side of a technology pusher or a payer. Though there's still a huge gap in understanding there that needs to be done. And then I'm afraid we will not be able to have sustainable healthcare systems if we don't invest in prevention. And that starts with education. A huge piece is educating young people right from the beginning. I know it's not maybe popular and it's a long-term strategy, but it absolutely needs to be done.
Thank you very much. And I think both your answers underline the importance of debates like the ones we've been having on Healthcare Next, in order to discuss those priorities. What are our priorities? What are our objectives? And how best to collaborate, how best to have that ongoing dialogue, those connections, Pierre, that you talked about between all of the actors who need to be involved. So that is all we have time for in this discussion. Many, many thanks to both of you for addressing the Debating Europe users' questions so frankly and thoroughly. Thank you to all of you for watching, and thank you to those who submitted such interesting questions for this series of online discussions run by Debating Europe on the future of healthcare. I do urge you, if you haven't already, to check out the other debates in this series, but it only remains for me to say thank you and goodbye.